January 1945, the German army has given up their efforts in Eastern Europe and is now retreating from the Soviet Union. The Russian Red Army, filled with anger for their fallen brothers and the devastation brought to their homeland, are moving forward with their sights set on German territory, seeking revenge for the years of Nazi occupation. And that's exactly what happened when the Soviet army set foot on German territory. An unbelievable amount of fear and pain was brought to Germany, not only to the political figures that were responsible for the war and the soldiers that fought in the war, but also to the innocent citizens. Today at Past Perspectives, we are taking a look at a part of the Second World War that is rarely brought to light and is often overshadowed by all the other atrocities that happened during that time. The horrifying things that were done to innocent Germans, especially the women by Soviet soldiers. Before we dive in, Subswan, his intent was clear: a war of extermination against the Soviet Union. If we look at this in hindsight, this was not only a war for territorial gains or strategic advantage, but a brutal campaign to wipe out the people of the Soviet Union and their way of life. Homes, villages, and even entire cities were razed to the ground, and millions of Soviet civilians were brutally killed. If we look at the sheer numbers, then we see that the Soviet Union experienced one of the most horrific atrocities of the Second World War. The number of losses the Soviets suffered is staggering. Over 20 million lives were taken, which is an unthinkable number. This represented about 13% of the Soviet Union's pre-war population. It's said that every family lost at least one family member due to the Nazi army. And just think about the sheer scale of the damage that has been done to a nation that lost every seventh of its people. The damages have been so devastating that it took the Soviet Union until the early 1960s for the economy of the Soviet Union to reach pre-war levels. The wounds that have been inflicted by the Nazi invasion were deep and traumatic, and it left a lasting scar on the Soviet people. This wasn't a pain that could be quickly forgotten. Instead, it turned into hatred, anger, and a burning desire for revenge against those that had brought such have seen the worst that war can inflict, and now they found themselves in control of their worst opponent's homeland. In their minds, the hour of reckoning had come for the German people. The beginning of the Soviet occupation didn't follow a plan. It was a complex situation between victors and those that lost the war, and therefore the motives for their atrocities has been a mix of political objectives, personal motivations, and deep-seated emotions. Many Germans now have been at the mercy of the Soviet forces and are braced for the worst. The entire time under the Nazi regime, they had been indoctrinated by propaganda about the Bolshevik beast, and now this beast was at their doorstep. Everywhere in Germany, from their cities and towns to their villages and communities, there was a fear as the Soviet forces took control. Stories of extreme violence, torture, looting, and abuse started to emerge. But one of the most horrific aspects of the Soviet occupation, one that still haunts families and survivors of that time, was the widespread sexual violence against German women. Little did Germans know at that point how long they had to endure this suffering, because even after the war ended, it took the Soviets several months to pull off their army, but we are going to talk more about that later on. As we now turn in the darker aspects of this occupation, I want to set a reminder to treat this topic with respect and care. It's important to remember that these tales of horror are not stories of faceless statistics. They represent real people who have gone through unimaginable horrors. Reports and accounts from that time reveal a terrifying reality: widespread sexual violence against German women by occupying Soviet forces. This was also not an isolated series of incidents like it was later tried to downplay by the war crime tribunals, but rather a pervasive problem that spread across occupied territories. In the early days of the Soviet occupation, sexual violence seemed to be ever present. It's hard to fathom the sheer scale of this brutality. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers. Many were subjected to this crime not just one time, but multiple times. And today it's said that the Soviet soldiers took everyone as young as 8 or as old as 80. It was an unspeakable horror that spared no one. Women from all sides of life, teachers, nurses, mothers, daughters, and even grandmothers, became a victim of this horrendous act. And it wasn't just the act of violence that left a scar in them. It was the fear, the anticipation, and the constant threat that further added to the psychological trauma. The impact was devastating and far-reaching, and it didn't just affect the women who were subjected to the violence, but also their families and the wider community. But we are going to talk about more of that in just a second. What makes these acts of violence even more disturbing is their systematic and organized nature. Some reports say that Soviet officers, those that were supposed to maintain order and control situations like this, turned a blind eye to this and often participated in these acts. And as I said earlier, this terror didn't end when the war did. Even after the guns had fallen silent and the rest of the world started to recover and heal, for 2 million German women, the nightmare continued. It took the Soviet army several months to fully withdraw, and during that time, they have brought chaos to Germany and its people. I know it's an unsettling reality to confront, but it's an essential part of the historical record, and I also want to point out that this is not to indict or single out the Soviets, but rather show the underlying horrifying consequences of the war. There are countless of stories about victims that spoke up about their fates, and one such story is displayed in the book Rape of Berlin. It shows the horrors a woman had to go through. Now, Lisa claims that she personally was never raped as she was heavily pregnant, but she witnessed countless of times how that happened. If you are interested in hearing the full topic, I definitely advise you to check out the book she wrote. Now, after the Soviet soldiers left Germany, these nightmares didn't end. Many women held these scars of war in their bodies and minds forever, often without any psychological support or even a little acknowledgement of their suffering. Pregnancies resulting from rape, sexually transmitted diseases, and the emotional trauma of sexual violence haunted these survivors, sometimes for their entire life. And even if we look at the war crime trials, they very rarely addressed sexual violence. It is even reported to downplay, normalize, or hide the abuses. Therefore, most of the